Hi, my name is Janette and I'm a senior at the University of Maine, Augusta. This is the spring 2019 semester of SSC 420 with Professor James Cook. My research project is called Is National Security More Important Than Human Rights? The research topic I worked on is the topic of national security versus human rights and how strongly populations of men and women feel about these two issues. To give you a little background information, in the summer of 2006, before the G8 summit, the Center for the Development of Democracy and Human Rights, the New Eurasia Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Kennan Institute hosted a roundtable discussion in Moscow on national security and human rights. The discussion focused on the importance of protecting human rights while ensuring national security and acknowledging that the two are codependent and mutually supporting. There was agreement among the participants that only a society built on respect for human rights and the rule of law can effectively combat terrorism. And it was agreed that suppressing democratic freedoms is not beneficial to achieving national security and will only weaken national security over time. This takes a lot of work on the part of the nation, the government, and its people. The purpose of this study is to find out if gender affects feelings on national security and human rights. This led me to my research question, do men believe that national security is more important than human rights? It is important for us to know if gender has an effect on attitude towards national security or human rights so that we can be aware of those biases when creating policies. National security and human rights should go hand in hand equally and when creating laws to keep our country safe. To show why understanding gender attitude is important, in the Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, Mary Kate Lizotte published a study called Authoritarian Personality and Gender Differences in Gun Control Attitudes. In this study, it has resulted that the gender gap on gun control attitudes is quite large. 53% of women supported an increase in gun control and only 40% of men supported an increase in gun control. Adding in variables of religious affiliation, political party, and demographic did not do much to change these numbers. So you can see that gender attitudes do infiltrate many different political issues. It is especially important that gender attitudes in politics is thoroughly researched to make sure that we understand natural gender attitudes in order to make sure that these attitudes are not entering political decision-making in the form of bias. A previous study polled Americans on how strongly they care about human rights. The results showed that Americans strongly support human rights. This support, however, was ranked below a person's feelings about national self-interest, and many did not want to spend money and resources defending human rights. This study also shows that greater education strengthens feelings on human rights principles, but has no bearing on willingness to spend money and resources defending human rights in other countries. Another study, similar to my own, called The Letters to the Editor and the War on Terror, took letters from 3 prominent newspapers to learn about discursive patterns and feelings about national security. The study concluded that the US and UK writers were supportive of their country's response to terror attacks, and even that their government needed to get tough and bring terrorist retribution. My hypothesis is that male Americans believe that national security is more important than human rights. I'm also trying to show that women believe that human rights are more important than national security. It may have been agreed upon at the G8 summit 13 years ago that national security and human rights should go hand in hand, but not everyone feels that way. And I'm also trying to find out if my hypothesis is correct or if there is no correlation between gender and feelings on national security over human rights. Participants are a random selection of people from any country who wrote letters to the editor of the New York Times between 2001 and present. These random letters are all related to national security and human rights, and these participants are anonymous, though their name and occupation are written at the bottom of the letter. I'm using information that is already freely available on the internet, and so there's no human interaction. I am using a purposive sampling method because I sought after letters to the editor that are written about national security and human rights. I found these letters in the archives of the New York Times on their website, spanning back to 2001. I'm using a correlational research design because I'm trying to figure out if men or women care more about national security or human rights. I read the letters and rated them as positive towards national security or human rights. I then analyzed the data to find out which gender cares more about national security and which cares more about human rights. These writers are responding to an article that they read about national security and human rights, so it was quite easy to figure out which they were in support of. As you can see, more women wrote in favor of human rights over national security. 90% of women were more positive towards human rights, and less than 10% of women were more positive towards national security. The men were a little bit closer. 52% of men were positive towards national security, and 47% were positive towards human rights. This was a surprise to my hypothesis because it was so close. I wasn't sure what the margin would be between men themselves. My p-value is 0.017, which means that it is less than 0.05, so I reject the null hypothesis and accept my hypothesis because there is results showing that my hypothesis is correct. There is strong evidence in this sample that men care more often about national security over human rights. I also found that women care more often about human rights over national security. In conclusion, this small study had an interesting outcome, rejecting the null hypothesis and accepting my hypothesis. This is an important result because it shows that there is a need to study this subject more and on a larger scale. If 95 random samples of letters to the editor of the New York Times show that men care more about national security over human rights, then that may mean that a larger sample would have the same outcome but on a larger scale, or it would show that there's no correlation. Either way, it's something that would be interesting to find out. I had a hard time finding a study similar to this one, but yet I found many different research articles expressing concerns of nations giving precedence over national security over human rights, therefore infringing on the human rights of its citizens. This is an important topic, and so I believe that there needs to be more studies done on gender attitude in relation to national security and human rights debate. It is an especially important subject in our country today. Thanks so much for listening to my research project, and feel free to email me with any questions at janette.king@maine.edu. Thanks and have a great day.